I had a moment to decide, but he was my best sales guy. So what do? Do I shoot the high performer? But in the case of values, I said, no, values trumps this situation. So I had to fire him. And everyone else in the organization saw that and realized, okay, these values are real.
Hello and welcome back to Mission 1, The Executive Edge. Today, we're talking with David Gardner. If you don't know his background, he was early at EA, became an EVP studio COO, was the CEO of Atari from 2008 to 2010, and then became a general partner at LVP, early investor in Supercell, early investor in Natural Motion, on the board of CD Projekt Red, has had a great impact on the games ecosystem around the world and certainly within the London ecosystem and European ecosystem as well.
David has had one of the most storied careers in gaming. As Dan notes, one of the first people that Ilka pitched Supercell to. In our conversation, he casually mentioned that he was sat on the same desk a long time ago with Demis Hassabis, the co-founder of DeepMind and one of the most influential people in AI in the world, and a Nobel laureate. Interesting though, he's super low ego, and actually we spent a lot of our conversation time not talking about all the wonderful successes, but actually some of the more difficult points. And it's interesting how the learning points came from the difficult times, maybe at Atari where things weren't going well, and that's when really the forced reflection and the growth comes from. As well as somebody who was putting values in consistently across the whole of his conversation, right? He's someone who cares deeply about values. And I think our listeners can be interested in, or you can be interested in, the fact that we have a lot of role models for success here, but here's one who's very deeply principled, and that comes across in everything that he says and does.
Absolutely. And the learnings from successes and failures add up to a wealth of knowledge that you can deploy later in your career. I'm excited to share with you today our conversation with David Gardner.
Hello and welcome to Mission 1, The Executive Edge. I'm Gerard Miles, your co-host for this podcast, joined as always by Dan Hampton over in Florida. And today we have an extremely special guest in David Gardner, who's also joining. He's an American, but also joining from London. David, welcome to the pod.
Thank you very much. Great to see you and Gerard and Dan. Very nice to be connected up here on the Ethernet. So I think motivation changes over time. I was excited about learning about Europe as a kid. A lot of kind of neighbors and friends sort of spoke about it. It was fun. I traveled over, and I used to come back. I was an early employee at Electronic Arts. And I used to come back raving about how exciting it was because it was new and it was exciting. It was, the grass was always greener on the other side. And it was actually those early trips that, and my enthusiasm for Europe, where the guys at EA were like, okay, you are always so positive about Europe. Why don't you go over there and help us figure out what to do next? And so that got me my first posting, if you like, my first assignment, which was to London. And, I guess everyone has their own first imprint. I grew up in California, mainly a little bit of time in the deep South, but I don't talk too much about Mississippi years. But this was my first really big city, London, and wow! I mean, I was so excited, and I've been excited about London ever since. That was in the early or the mid '80s, I suppose, and which was the start of the boom era for London. The kind of change of kind of political momentum, the city of London becoming more deregulated, so the expansion of the kind of global banking centers, et cetera. And of course, in our world, it was gaming, and it was tech. It was Sinclair Spectrums and Commodore 64s and VIC-20s and BBC Micros and Micron. So it all just kind of kicked off. So and it's been as I think we all know, it's been one of the major gaming centers of the universe. So I've just loved it here.
David, we've jumped in the middle here. We should just introduce to our listeners, and for the sake of younger listeners, we'll explain what a spectrum is as well at some point. There we go. So David, you have had I'm gonna use cliches. We do in these sort of intros, so you've probably heard them all before, but sort of a storied career, shall we say, in a very positive way. You were early on at Electronic Arts. I believe you started as a customer support role or customer service type role. We can go into that. You then rose through the ranks and through the geographies as well to become EVP over there and studio CEO. You then went to Atari, which is one of the great brands of gaming, and particularly here in UK, like it's held in extremely high regard. And I know Dan's a big fan of Atari, so
we had one,
yeah, exactly. So your complaints to David, if you ever had any problems with the Atari system or later in its iterations, and then evolved further on that, for having had that very successful executive career, going to the EVP level to the C level. You then were you a co-founder of London Venture Partners? You're also a general partner over there.
Yeah.
And London Venture Partners, again, I mean, it's you guys, forgive me saying, you're sort of the OGs of games investing certainly in Europe, and I think globally recognized as really being early on to spot the potential of games as a venture capital sector, and I think again easily one of the very top funds in Europe and in the West for reputation for investing in games, and I think you've got a little bit beyond games as well, maybe. So really sort of seen success in quite different areas, and then again on David to then be a board member, and I believe you're on the board of Embracer. Again, probably make a film about those years, right? Like, and then currently you're, if I have your title right, deputy chair of the supervisory board at CD Projekt Red, which, again, if we talk about European powerhouses of AAA, it's really up there at the top. And again, we could talk a whole hour about why they've been successful and when they haven't been successful, and then how they've sort of come back from that, right, as well, which I think is interesting. But David, it took a long time to introduce you, which I think is credit to just what you've done and how different it is. So first of all, I'd say big thank you from us and from our listeners to joining us on the pod.
That's great. It's always fun to talk about things that you love, and appreciate being on the podcast.
Great. Dave, kicking us off, do you want to tell us about that? Just again, we can't go into all the detail, but
yeah, of course,
we're focused often on executives who are thinking about how do you get to those very top levels of jobs, and you've made that journey. When you were starting in customer services with EA, were you thinking, yeah, one day I'm going to be EVP of this place and I'm going to shoot there, and that was the straight line? Or tell us about how that evolved.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I don't think we had EVP titles then, but I was young. I started at EA when I was 17, so that was a little bit unusual already. And as you get older, time goes on, you kind of hear the stories of like when they first met me, and I remember now being told they all thought, Trip Hawkins was the founder. He had met me in the context of the Consumer Electronics Show, and we hit it off and had actually a polite but an argument about a product and a company. And so that made an impression, and he thought, okay, I like that sort of opinion thinking person. I want to hire him at this startup, and he was starting Electronic Arts. So anyways, it was where I started, and I did a few different roles. I had actually previously to that been working 3 years at a computer retailer, which at that time there really weren't chains or things like that. It was specialty shops in different cities, and so I was pretty deep on the retail front and knew all about the products, and there were dozens of software products, not hundreds of thousands as we have now, and I knew how the trade system worked, etc. So my first job was actually to help them set up the distribution terms and conditions and the kind of retailer training, and then once we shipped games, where it's like, okay, well, we had 15 or 20 employees, like somebody's got to do customer service. And I was definitely the youngest guy. So I got assigned the CS job. But I think there were definitely some learnings from that. And ironically, I used to therefore open all the post. All the mail came to me, and we got letters from abroad. And there was an Italian that kept writing us letters, and he would write us incredible, beautiful art letters. I still remember his name, Mauro Marchetti. I don't know where he lives or if he's a miracle listens to this podcast. He was a beautiful artist. And that again contributed to my fascination with Europe. I thought, what is this? So I did make it a goal to try to get out of customer service as soon as I could, but it did, help me learn about dealing with people and having motivation, wanting to get out. But fortunately, I would say I've been able to just love what I do. And then we had particularly then at the startup culture at EA, there was so much that needed to be done. If you were willing, and that was more important than kind of experience, competence came through doing. If you had the right attitude, you had the right kind of, I don't want to necessarily say just intelligence, but kind of compute, right? There's kind of personality, there's the ability to learn, there's the kind of willingness to not give up. Those things all played a role to getting promoted.
It sounds like you loved the startup journey. Were you really interested in kind of an early stage environment, or was it games that attracted to you to EA, or was it both?
It was definitely both. And as I mentioned, I worked at the retail store, and of course, games were fascinating. At first we were like selling computers to do word processing and databases and things like that. But then games started showing up, and there were these kind of early graphic adventures, and Sierra Online shipped some stuff, and you were like, wow, and it was painting this stuff. A lot of the stuff, I was selling apples, and Apple had a very peculiar kind of video graphics register, and it was not continuous. So if you would write an image to memory, it would kind of appear at the top of the screen, in the middle of the screen, at the bottom of the screen. It wasn't sequential. It was a very strange way, but it would paint these pictures and these things would come to life. And it was just, I don't know, I can still remember today the excitement of seeing the screen come alive with a piece of art. And I loved computers. I just loved computers. And then gaming was, of course, fun. Very few people don't like games. And I really loved business. So suddenly I'm doing business with games at a startup on computers. So no one could stop me. I was just so excited. And I was fascinated by this Silicon Valley concept. I was in the West Coast, and this kind of venture capital fundraising, starting up new ideas. Trip came out of the then big Apple computer, starting something up. So these themes kind of have echoed and repeated, because now I'm doing venture and still in the game space. So I'm sure we'll touch upon some of those things. But I think it was, a lot of these things are like, are they ducks that get imprinted when they first, kind of arrive on the scene, and then once you kind of have those impressions, they stick with you. So that's kind of what happened to me at a young 17-year-old. Maybe as you learn and as you mature, you start to become a little bit more strategic or thoughtful. And so I have had to make some decisions, and we can come to those conversations later. But yeah, I think the big news for me was that I was in a great place, and it was rapidly growing. So that just presented huge numbers of opportunities, and the company was willing to take risks. I was not, and am not, a college graduate. I didn't follow at all a typical role. I mean, our founders were Harvard and Stanford MBA students, and had raised venture capital. They were all very kind of impressive CVs, but we were also dealing in a brand new industry that didn't really have. You couldn't hire anyone with years of experience. And I actually had years of computing experience with Apple IIs and the relevant kind of audience and technology, and even though I was 17. So it's partly a story of that, and that rapid growth providing opportunity, and the culture of the company, in this case, Electronic Arts, to promote from within and try. But we were growing like crazy. So we were hiring all the time. It was good. It was a good place.
David, was there like a secret sauce here in terms of your upward ascension within EA? I know you mentioned taking on the role like customer service that that kind of defaulted to you, but was it just a kind of a mixture of taking on the tasks that or filling in the gaps where the company needed you, or was there something else that kind of helped propel that upward ascension along with the growth across?
I think it's a combination. I was passionate and not afraid of work And because I was at the company from the beginning, and really, again, you start young and you believe everything they tell you. So I was very much, you cut me and I bled, kind of EA blood. And so, and that's actually, I think, what made me useful to send to Europe. The idea was I was, if you like, the kind of DNA that was being kind of chipped off of the then, San Mateo, the California mothership, and then transplanted. And I think that I mean, of course, it was a good benefit to me, but I think that was smart because as EA kind of grew and went international to all the different European countries, it very much felt like EA. And people would comment on that when they would come visit from the US, and they would say, wow, in fact, I think, held our DNA better and longer than the US, which of course continued to grow, and it was a big market, but the rate of hiring there meant that, and the change of leadership there just meant the DNA eventually changed. So I think that was kind of the main event there.
Interesting. And David, so thinking about the crew, you went from being EVP of EA, a very large company. Was it listed at that point?
No, it listed about 10 or 15 years after it started.
Okay. So you sort of went to a very senior role there, and then you went to be CEO of Atari.
Yeah.
Just tell us about, was that a step change? Was that something you'd always wanted to be?
I started developing the kind of desire to be a CEO. I had, you mentioned some of the titles, et cetera. I had a COO role at EA. I was, prior to that, running the international businesses. But, it's always a team effort, and these and companies decide what to put in or not to these different verticals. And at one point I had everything geographically based. Then we went to a global studio and a global publishing setup. So those things then got separated from geography and put into kind of functional areas. So I thought, I wanted to try to do the whole piece. And when after 25 years at EA, I eventually ended up living back in California at headquarters, and weirdly had reverse culture shock, even though I am American. I've lived most of my life in Britain, and I found I missed being in London and being in the UK. So after a few years of being in California, I moved back, and I didn't have a job. I had to kind of restart. And that's when the Atari opportunity happened. And for those of, Dan, like Atari as an American, it was one of those kind of cultural things, but it eventually exploded. Hasbro Toys ended up, another American company, bought the brands and the assets. And then, in another twist of fate, a French company called Infogram bought Hasbro's digital piece. Hasbro refocused on the classic toys and paper business. And so Atari got owned by Infogrames in France. And Infogram was going through a change. Private equity had taken it over, and they were looking for a new management team. And that's when I came in. And so I rebranded the business to the original Atari brands, even though under the brands, it wasn't really the original Atari, even though they had Pong and they had Breakout and they had all the kind of franchises. It was just different.
Yeah. And what was that change like, or was there a change, do you think? Or again,
Massive.
You're thinking about, you're going up to, exactly, tell us about that. Like, how do you, and again, think about our listeners who might be thinking about, let's say they're at a director level now and they're thinking about, okay,
Yes.
What does it take to be the VP, the C level? Like, what are the gear shifts from someone who's done
I tell
it? What do you have to go through?
by the way, I would be honest on the outset, and I would say my time at Atari was not successful. I can blame it on the market. We had the 2008 financial crash. I can blame it on it's difficult to turn around in the gaming world, something that's underperforming dramatically and losing money, very hard to turn it around. But ultimately, I took on the role. I should have known those things, and so I owe that. That's my fault. But I did learn. Unfortunately, you learn the most through failure and pressure, I think, and that's why we probably. It's getting better, the attitude toward failure, particularly, Europe has always had a hard, the US and the kind of Silicon Valley piece, they always talk up failure, but it's harder in Europe. But failure is the accelerator of learning if you're open to it. And I would say the big shock, I remember, when you kind of walk in and all eyes are on you and everyone's looking at you like, what do we do? Particularly in a situation where things aren't going well, they want help. And it's different if you arrive in a company that is doing well and you're the new CEO. You kind of have time, think momentum. I mean, the systems are just running. You kind of get on the ship and it's like, yeah, it's great. Everything's working here. I think I'll have another coffee and kind of take. But if you arrive to something on fire, you don't really have time to mess around. And I came out of a very successful company that had been successful for a very long time. And the systems are all working. The products are all coming to market. The sales numbers are all getting blown open and you're achieving new record profits. Very different when you arrive at the opposite scenario. And I probably hadn't thought through quite enough. I knew it was broken. And I thought, okay, I knew what I wanted to do. I wanted to turn into a digital products company. I wanted to trade on the fantastic brand history, which was, I think at the time, it was the 17th most recognized brand and hadn't had any marketing spent on it for decades. I thought there was enormous potential, but I didn't really appreciate how it needed to be dealt with, straight away. And you are responsible. And when you're part of a team and you're not the CEO, of course, you're trying to build a team. There are a lot of things to talk about, being a CEO and building a team. But ultimately, as they say, the buck stops with you. People kind of wait for your commissioning or your decision making or your kind of setting a direction. But when you're a VP or part of another team, you're not making that final. You're making recommendations. You're kind of getting feedback from everybody else, and then it kind of snaps together. And that CEO that you're working for sends you off. And when you have to do it, and especially for the first time, and especially when it's a crisis, I found it too tough. I wasn't proactive enough. In fact, some of the things I did, the things I reverted to were based on values of, we need to tell the truth. We need to do the right thing. We need to, a lot of these values that I had are good values, but actually when you're very weak, you have to be very careful. And I remember making a comment that, we had stuff at retail that had not sold through. And at EA, we didn't like that. We would keep the shelves clean and new products would come out. We always had new things so we could mark down the old stuff. Well, we didn't have that strength. We didn't have the ability at the then Atari to take the dead stock out of retail. That would bankrupt us. It wasn't even an option. It wasn't a question of integrity. It was just a question of what we could afford to do. And so I found that, you really need to have emergency measures. And I think if I had known that going in, I would have just structured who I recruited and how I dealt with it extremely differently. Atari goes on. You may have seen some of the branding and some of the clever things that they've done. It's just not a typical game company. And in fact, it's under new leadership in the last kind of 18 months that's doing some interesting stuff. I had a very good chat with the new CEO who reached out to me 6 months ago, and it's very interesting to see how they're renovating that place.
I've seen some of the Web3 games coming. I see maybe an Atari Classic or something as well. But David, I imagine that CEO experience has been valuable for you, beyond those years and as an investor as well.
As an investor and as a board member, I found it actually has helped me a lot. And we were a public company, so that was another extra stress. So, I think it is good to be ambitious and it's good to try to be a CEO, but you also have to think about, especially if you're a first-time CEO, you have to think a little bit about your personality, what you're strong at, what you're not strong at, and try to be prepared for what you're going to. Maybe don't pick the first hardest thing.
I was just going to say those years were not the best years either in terms of timing. 2008, with the crisis. So one could foresee that. So,
but Dave, I think that's really interesting because we've talked in the past a little bit about advice to people about the C-suite. It's like there's a little bit of careful what you wish for, right? And I think people we've seen it. People get so swept up in sometimes wanting the CEO job. It's almost. It takes over other considerations, maybe other thought process you might go if it was just, another similar type role. And also I thought it was interesting what you were saying about the the sort of the transparency piece. I think we've heard that again of it's hard sometimes, isn't it? Because you've got values and you've got instincts that sometimes work as a human level, right? As you think like, hey, I want to be transparent because I'm a transparent person, and like to not be is somehow like morally wrong, right? But I have heard that from a number of execs who are saying you don't have to share everything, right? Like there's a level of noise that people don't need to worry about, right? You need to slightly like protect them, not lie to them, but protect them from being worried about information that's not their day-to-day concern.
Yeah, I mean, basically, I think if people buy into a plan, I mean, you can be honest about the challenges, but you can say, these are challenges we will face later. Today's challenges are these. This is the sequence to deal with this issue. And, eventually, you ship in that small example of kind of retail inventory. Once you ship something that's good, then you can balance out the issues later. You just don't deal with those things up front. You have to sequence things. So that's a bit of a, you don't have to.
David, I mean, just picking up on that, I suppose it wasn't you, because again, I think we're big fans of like, the learning aspect, right? And the iterative aspect. And, when you think about your career, and again, we're trying to advise people on careers, I suppose we're often trying to say to them, like, make the right decision, right? We're trying to help them make the right call, think about things ahead. But like, how do you feel about that? I mean, do you sort of feel like actually, again, you're someone who's taken risks, you're someone who backs people who are taking entrepreneurial risks. Would you advise someone to say like, hey, actually it is okay to do that. It might not work out, but you still gain value from that and learn it, or do you learn from that and it's part of a tapestry of career that's still accretive to you if that's what you want? Or do you think a bit about different? I'm curious, like what your advice might be to yourself, a month before you go into that job. We'd say, yeah, still go do it. You'll learn a lot. Or hey, actually give this one a skip maybe.
It's a very good question. Very hard to give a generic answer to. I think there is wisdom around every decision and wisdom in many counselors. So I think it's good to, maybe your wife or husband or whoever your partner is, it might be your best friends, it might be people you trust on a subject, to try to process it. Nowadays, it might even be chatting with ChatGPT or Claude. But when I reflect back, I think actually I love risk, and I've been quite careful, even though sometimes it sounds like I haven't. I actually look back and I think I'm a little bit more careful than I would have, that I would like to be. I think taking risks is very good. You need to take calculated risks. And again, I think taking the Atari job could have been, I think we had brilliant ideas. I just really got stuck on dealing with the problems rather than the future. And I would have organized my team very differently had I been aware of the problems. And you could have assigned a fireman to the old problems and a kind of a super creative hit squad on the new things. And then it could have been a very different outcome. So yeah, just kind of getting a good understanding of what you're stepping into and having a reasonable battle plan. Because as the human brain has various levels of functionality. It has intuition and reaction to things that you train for. I mean, you were I don't know, Dan, if you on the pilot stuff. I fly small planes, and one of the most amazing things is they can train you to do things that are unnatural. For example, when the engine is on fire, your nature is to scream and run and get the heck out of there. But actually, you see you saw it with a Sully. So you need to prepare yourself for these things so that your reaction, and it's nice to stay in a zone where you sort of feel like, oh, I've got the intuitive reaction to what to do, but it doesn't stretch you, doesn't bring you further. And I think ultimately you kind of get bored. So I think the idea of taking risks is good learning, and then that learning gets put into place, and that helps you do the quick calculations and do a better job once you've kind of processed that learning. That's kind of where I'm trying to head on that.
So, I mean, it's David, you've had a lot of experience across multiple functions and environments. How are you thinking? How has that shaped your hiring philosophy? How has it shaped how you're evaluating talent now as you're thinking about it from a board level perspective? But what's your general kind of philosophy on hiring people? So
it's evolved over the years, and it's a cliche, of course, hire the best people, but which is, of course, that's right. But I think there are two parts: identifying them, and actually, I think everyone's talented. The question is are their talent sets correct for the task that you have? I remember hiring a head of marketing and was very excited. And then I watched in front of I think they were the right person. You know, you interviewed dozens of people, and then they just crashed and burned in front of the in our case, the other kind of country level marketing leads. And I thought, what have I done? I knew instantly I had made the wrong call. And then I, of course, was embarrassed, and I thought, oh no, you know, you're going to fire somebody, and that's horrible, and I hate firing them, and they were in a good job before I hired them. And then I realized they were really good at something else, and we put them in charge of external relationships. And they made the company far more money, and they grew an incredible network. And I realized, wow, I very nearly ruined, I don't know if I ruined their career, but very nearly just kind of reactionary, took somebody out, when actually it's just getting their skills in the task. And then they flew. So that was a huge learning for me. And I think the culture of the business attracts good talent. So getting the right culture in place so that you are attractive. Hopefully nowadays, leaders are more collaborative and, you know, not, I mean, everyone's got a personality, but you want to release talent. So when you work with people, I think people like working with people that appreciate them, encourage them, set them up to succeed, invest in them. So I think those are all, you know, you're trying to be attractive and thoughtful. But I think do not be afraid. I wanted to say, actually, I don't know if you hire good talent as much as you need to fire bad talent. And I think one of the problems is, you know, we used to focus so much on hiring the right talent, and people would be in so many interviews, and you try to make the best decision. And then you find out it takes about a year to find out if they're any good, because you get the first impressions, but then you become either you're distracted and you just don't want to deal with it because firing is a horrible thing and you feel afraid of it. But actually, people watch, does the company fire on values or not? And we had a situation once where a sales guy was very successful, and then, you know, he would always kind of win the sales award and this, that. And then one day we figured out one of the reasons he was so successful was at the end of the quarter, he would speak to his customers and say, I need you to take a bunch of stuff that you don't need and then you don't want, but you can send it back next week. And so he would stuff the channel, which is against our protocol. And it was against, actually later in life, there are all these regulations about, you know, sales have to be real, et cetera. So you can't kind of scam the books. And I realized what he was doing was wrong. He knew it was wrong. And I had a moment to decide, but he was my best sales guy. So what do? Do I shoot the high performer? But in the case of values, I said, no, values trumps this situation. So I had to fire him. And everyone else in the organization saw that and realized, okay, these values are real. So that then reinforces the right culture, that then attracts the right people, and then people perform. Also, it helps kind of put guidelines on, you know, people are like, I'm not going to do that, I'm going to get fired. So I think firing, I mean, you know, letting people go, if you want to use the nice talk, setting them free to find their, you know, best self. Those
doing
things,
them a favor in that language.
Yeah, doing them a favor.
I want you to be a better person, so that's what I'm going to fire. Yeah.
I mean, obviously, if it's gross misconduct, it feels pretty easy. But if it's so I would say you obviously make your best choice. You try your hardest to get a great person, but then do not be afraid to make a change. So, you know, then you will eventually get it right. And I think that's probably an underutilized.
David, take us through that process, because I think, again, we hear different things. Do you think, I mean, my own experience might be, I think gut leads and then you sort of catch up with it, right? You're like testing it. Then after you test it a lot, you usually find out your gut was right. Is that how you, like, is that losing time testing it? Do you feel like you know pretty quickly and you have to validate it a little bit? Like, how do you decide actually, because as you said, one case might be the wrong role. I need to move this person to a better role. Yeah. The other case might be bad hire. I need to get rid of this person regardless. Like, how do you tell between those two, and like, what's your toolkit?
So it's so good. I mean, I am quite an intuitive person because I didn't grow up through, you know, kind of a rigorous academic approach to things. There is wisdom in getting input from others. And that's one of the reasons I work collaboratively for investing. I don't want to be just kind of working, you know, shooting from the hip. I learned so much from other people's views. And that's why when we would do interviews, if you get quite, you know, half a dozen people interviewing, and then you get everyone together and you debrief, I think it's amazing what people spot and what gets, you know, learned from that. But I think you don't want to be flippant with people. So you are messing people around. So I think, it is a big responsibility to hire someone, and you don't want to just say, it didn't work out, goodbye. I think almost, as I started the conversation, I think everyone has talent, and it's a question of, hopefully you have a role to then, or you can organize that role to lean into that talent and create that success circuit. Sometimes if you're a small company and you just can't, maybe you have to let them go. But yeah, or if it's a particular emergency, you just can't deal with it. But by and large, I think you can work over time. If people are just not motivated, or there are major ethical issues and you didn't spot going in, then maybe the right decision is to let somebody go.
And I'm just curious about that. They're at a certain level and they're worried that there's a cap, right, to where they can get to if they don't have that CV, or if they're feeling a little bit of imposter because or maybe coming from a country they've emigrated, they're not feeling a little bit out of place there, because that can be a real thing as well.
Interesting.
What advice would you give that person, a listener who's sort of saying, do I fit in there? Or like, I feel like I'm I'm playing a different game to everyone else. What do I do?
I think mostly that's self-imposed. So you're downgrading yourself unnecessarily. I think people will more and more. We have a performance culture, and it has continued to go in a fantastic direction. So if you add value, if you are good, if you work collaboratively, and you make sense, you've got insight, you treat people properly and treat people well, I don't think there are those limits. And shame on companies that impose those limits. And I think they will ultimately they'll get surpassed by better companies that have a better culture, rewarding high performance talent. So I don't, and I think also if there's too much focus on, I think if there's a little bit too much, you're stressing over it, you kind of bring it up and you make it an issue, that kind of just puts friction around the issue. I think probably not necessary.
David, it's just thinking back to your most successful hires. Has there been a common thread with those? Were they always obvious, or was there something else that you can point to, I guess?
I think curiosity, stamina, and chemistry with the company's culture are the most common success factors. And I think, and it's super cool. I tell you what is super cool nowadays, having been in the industry for a while, and also a good lesson to always treat people well. Literally, and I go to meetings with, like, these are the most senior people in the company. Like, they were in customer service when I started. They've so far surpassed my levels, etc. I was like, and we can have some very fun moments where we realize that they're more senior than I am now, and it's amazing what just to see people fly. So it's really cool, and I definitely feel like, not feeling like you have to always be on top, or you have to be better than everyone you've ever hired or whatever. Actually, it's quite freeing to go the opposite way, to see people just go as as high as they can go. I worked. He didn't work for me directly, but if you guys know Demis Hassabis, who's started DeepMind and has gone on to become a Nobel laureate, a Knight, a senior executive at Google, and has had major impact on AI technology. The guy was a programmer at Bullfrog on Theme Park, and we sat opposite each other. I was the product manager, and the guy is just, he's by any objective measures outstripped everyone in the games industry for the impact on society, and it's incredible. And he remains a wonderful human being throughout the whole process. But it's just wild to see, when you just kind of let people go, how far they can go.
Yeah, that's a great story, by the way, David. You sit across from these guys. That's a great right? room, right? Like a line of, what happened to the other people in that room? How many know? That's great. And talking about, again, you're a general partner at London Venture Partners, as mentioned, one of the premium venture capital funds in games in the world. But tell us about, and again, we have people who either maybe execs who at the back of their mind are thinking, one day I'd like to go out and found a company, thinking about that. I think a lot of people do. Should I go take VC money? Is that interesting route? it goes up and down, and I've got my own views on it. But tell us a little bit, like, how is from a talent perspective, when you're assessing a set of founders in front of you, how does that differ? Give us an insight to the mindset of an investor. How does that differ from, say, a CEO hiring his team, or does it differ? Like, I'm curious about that.
I think it does differ. I think it differs because in the case of venture, or in the case of a startup, you also have to have people that can handle the lack of resource and still manage to find a way. One of the big things I realized, and I learned this also when I was at Atari, where we didn't have the kind of balance sheet that an EA had. We jokingly, when we first did Formula One, it was like, we did some market research, we saw the size of the market, we thought, yeah, let's do Formula One. We find who's the licensing agent, we go meet Bernie Eccleston in some crazy place in Hyde Park, and he's an absolutely terrifying guy.
Not too crazy a place to meet Bernie Eccleston, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
And, we needed like $5 million. So we called the CFO back in the States. He wires us $5 million, and, boom, we're in the business. That, of course, we were already successful, but that's like nothing compared to what you have to do as a founder at a startup where you don't have any money. You might have all kinds of great ideas. Then you have to convince investors. You have to do everything on a shoestring budget, and it's just so different. The level of stress and kind of inventiveness and tenacity that you have to have. Of course, eventually it works, and sadly, statistically, in most cases, it doesn't work. But sometimes it works, and then it's incredible because you've built something and you've changed something and you've created a whole new culture, and it's an incredible experience. But it is very different. And so the learning I've had, we've invested in lots of people that have come out of other companies. And at first you sort of think, oh, they've had all this experience, that, they know all this stuff. And then you learn that actually you want people who've had failure, or who've had to have the grit, and who could kind of convince people to do things they wouldn't otherwise do, including give somebody money, versus the big successful executives who, just as that with that story I've said, it's one thing to lead a team and have so-called infinite resource compared to the other scenario. And often, I remember I just didn't know that much about cash because EA was cash positive, and we had hundreds of millions in the bank, and now they have billions in the bank, and you just don't think about it. It's just like something that you wire. But then when you're at a startup, you realize, yeah, exactly. And when you're at a startup, that is you're counting the days you have alive, and you have, it's a completely different relationship.
To touch upon an area that might be a little bit controversial, right? Because founders can be slightly different beings, shall we say. And I was listening to a Louis Theroux podcast about this today, and they were talking about there's a bit of a myth of these kind of strange, sometimes borderline sociopathic, right? Like view of these founders, right? Like who are, as you said, can convince people to give them money, like in some sort of Svengali type way, right? And are different from other people. And that can be sort of hagiographied, that can be sort of, in our culture, like you've got to be this kind of almost non-person to go and be a successful founder, right? Obsessive, perhaps not ethical, like all these other things. Like, just do you have a comment on that? Do you see a generation coming through who are trying to be a mask and be super odd just almost because that they think that's successful? Or do you think that's a good formula? Do you think it's a bad formula? Just curious on your own views on that.
Yeah, it's great. It's a great observation. I've seen lots of different types of people successful as founders. Ultimately, people have to be willing to be convinced and therefore trust that you have a shot at doing something. And sometimes it's because of that Svengali personality type that you mentioned. We coming from the games industry and funding the games industry kind of avoid that because we sort of feel like we want to see the real skills and the real talent of the people. And we don't mind so much if someone is kind of more into the product or more technical. And the only extra little consideration we have to have is, are they credible in front of non-games investors when they need to raise larger sums of money? So being a good communicator is an important skill in that regard. But I remember, we were early investors in the Supercell team, and they are such straight shooters. It helps that they're Finnish. All the Nordic people seem to, I don't know what they do in that part of the world, but they're just like, we're going to do this, and it's going to take 3 weeks, and it's going to cost this much money, and they always do it, and they smile, and then it always happens, and it's like, how do they do that? But they it's not that they get to success through that, but they just build a trust, and they were just authentic games guys, and there was just no messing around, and they were on a mission to try to crack the code for what was coming next, and crack it they did in a huge way.
David, tell us more about the story then, because we're going to take a moment.
Yeah.
Like all these names you're dropping as like it's the who's who, right? So were you there when the first pitch Ilka comes in and says like, hey, we're going to do this? Tell us about that initial reaction.
We were the first capital in with a bunch of other kind of early investors and kind of personal investors. There were a handful of them, and they had come through the kind of mobile game era where it was J2ME. It was all the kind of, not smartphones, but pre-iPhone, the kind of all the horrible 300 SKUs because no phone was the same, and it was all the total. Anyways, they kind of slugged their way through that, and but they had games background. And what was incredible and interesting, well, we'd already started putting LVP together, and we'd met quite a few entrepreneurs, and we're getting a sense of the quality of entrepreneurs out there in the market, particularly here in Europe. And what was very different about their team, first of all, as I mentioned, they had this kind of cultural vibe. They were very straight shooters, and they had a lot of experience, and they were just saying, this is what's broken, this is how we're going to fix it, and this is how we're going to operate. And they had this philosophy of not being afraid to kill. And that systematic approach and that kind of simple measuring system, and the lack of fear of not wasting time on stuff that it wasn't going to work, and their reference checks, etc. It just made sense. And even though we didn't actually particularly love the game they were working on, it was a Facebook game, but we just thought, okay, if this is true, they're going to kill this game. And they did. They eventually killed it and moved on and did Clash of Clans and Heyday and shifted platforms. But they also, delighted their customers. It was culturally extremely different seeing how they would charge, how customers enjoyed giving Supercell money to play their games versus at the time, the brand values got very defined by that. And, again, Supercell is one of the most successful, richest companies, and everyone loves them, even though they're, super successful.
Was their fast iteration, which I'm assuming you say faster, quick to kill, is that something you look for and have looked for since in other founding teams? Is that the DNA, or were there other things you take from that? Because that was such a huge success, right?
It's an honesty that I'm looking for. So the quick kill was we're not going to take the attitude of we can make this work, and this is our baby, and it's an ugly baby, but just wait, and all that kind of stuff. They just were willing to take tough decisions, and a startup, you have to take really tough decisions. Sometimes the decision is stick with it, but you have to be all in, and you have to be willing to just hear the data. And so we're looking for people that can be very efficient. So you have to be quick, because that's your only advantage, really. You're broke, you've got ideas, you're unencumbered. So you have to be kind of a rapid strike force. And we've made some mistakes. We've invested in some teams that spent 5 years trying to build stuff. And we thought at the time it made sense. But we sort of had to relearn what's the role of venture in the games ecosystem. We can't fund everything. It doesn't make sense. Some things belong to big game companies with huge balance sheets, and other things belong to kind of startups.
How is this? Appreciate you sharing that. How is this kind of shaped your view as a on the board, or as you evaluate teams, you're evaluating ideas, you're giving your guidance and influence. Like how has all this kind of shaped your view as a board member these days?
I'm trying to learn, try to learn what the company mission is, and what of that mission is making that company successful, trying to protect that. I was, on a call today where we had we're really trying to quantify and discuss risk. And Steve Jobs has this great quote about, first the company is successful, then they hire a lot of accountants and lawyers or something. I forget what his kind of list of things. And then they kind of end up taking over, and then the creative people get shoved out, and then the company stops innovating, and then they stop being committed and the company dies. So in the context of that, I think you have to take risk and you have to protect the culture that makes the amazing products that makes the company successful. And you have to understand how to, I think, especially as you grow up as a company, how to mitigate risk as you have more people, more customers, more investors. Your job is to be as consistent as you can. And, as you get bigger, you can kind of bring help with you to mitigate these risks. And that's what I'm trying to make sure that a company has the right resource, the right kind of priority list, and is trying to do as much as they can, but not so much that they blow up, is kind of a simple way of saying it. And there's a governance piece that comes with being on the board, but I think the governance can also be I don't want to say a destroyer, but it is, I think it's about risk adjusted activity. You have to sort of say, we must take risk. But then if we're going to take that risk, how do we either communicate what we're doing to investors so they know they're on this risk, so they're willing to be on this risky path. But then what do you do to protect and report that risk? I don't know if I'm making sense on that, but I'm trying to figure that out. And then attract the right talent to deliver on that mission. So that's the other big piece, is you're really having to, I'm really trying to go deep on the talent side to make sure that, do you have the right people in the right roles? And then are you supporting them, training them, equipping them, and rotating them out if they're the wrong ones? And that whole pipeline, because ultimately it comes down to the people that are delivering.
Absolutely. Yeah. And trying to preserve the secret sauce along the way, I guess. Yeah.
Do you think if you went back to some of your EA days, and now with that knowledge of being a board member, that would influence some of those hiring decisions you made back then? Is there any sort of, what would you, do you think you might do differently, right? If again, think of our listeners who haven't been a board member of CD Projekt Red, like what can they absorb from your mistakes or learnings to their own executive situation today?
Yeah, I think, I would, a lot of times the board is viewed as the high school principal or the headmaster or whatever. I think as collaborative of a relationship as possible is good. I mean, the board needs to be objective, and I think that's one of their key roles, is making sure that they're not getting sucked in and drinking the Kool-Aid, but still understanding the mission and the potential, and pushing as well as protecting, and having a different, where we're scanning on a different time horizon. We're not doing day to day, we're doing longer. So I think it would, I would, again, my biggest shaping and impact was at the early days of EA was the intensive feeling about the company culture having to be right. And I carried that through. I feel that really is so important, that the board protects and encourages the right culture. And under that, a lot of unspoken things around integrity and treating people correctly and owning up to mistakes and being a learning machine, and a lot of really positive things that can, where you can kind of work. I mean, Supercell is another great culture focus. They have this amazing statement, which is, when we succeed, we drink beer. And when we have to shut a game down and failed, we drink champagne, because we want to encourage the teams to take the risks, to learn, and to try. So they stay humble with success, but they stay ambitious with attempts. And I think that's a great metaphor. So I think you want that, because otherwise you'll kind of create we don't want to take any risks and everything's working, and of course nothing stays the same.
Yeah, nothing stays the same. David, I mean, I think some really consistent points there about values, right? It came up in that last answer. I think it came up in multiple points, and I think that's, again, I will sing your praises to those who don't know, but I think you're seen as an investor of great integrity, right? And I I won't say there are other people I can think of who don't have that, but I think it is again that there's a lot of views on LinkedIn and social media about venture capitalism and all the rest. But I think anyone who knows you, David, knows
Some of it earned.
Great.
Yeah.
Some of it indeed earned. Yeah, again, we could do another podcast where we do the tear down, right? As the other thing that's popular now, the tear down of VCs. Yeah. But no, I think your reputation as somebody, again, people who know you as friends and all the rest, they speak of a person with great values, sort of in the boardroom and outside of it. So, David, we're at time, but thank you so much for coming on.
Brilliant.
Onto the
pod. So much fun. Thanks, guys, for pushing this out and trying to encourage people to level up. I appreciate it.
That's another episode of Mission 1, The Executive Edge. If you found this valuable, hit subscribe and leave us a review. It helps other professionals discover the show.
Have a question about executive hiring or want to share your own experience? Reach out on LinkedIn or visit mission1.io/podcast. We read everything, and your stories often inspire future episodes.
The Executive Edge is brought to you by Mission 1, where we specialize in placing senior leaders at tech, entertainment, and AI companies. Learn more at mission1.io.
Thanks for listening, and we hope to see you again soon on The Executive Edge.